Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, with mass destruction and millions of tons of rubble, rebuilding Gaza requires tens of billions of dollars. So who'll pick up the tab? And what are the challenges to making the Strip habitable again? Reduce the price of oil. That's Donald Trump's demand to the OPEC Plus group. The US president says the move will deprive Russia of energy revenue and help to end the war in Ukraine. But will it? And inflation has returned to Japan after decades of stagnation. To curb that, the central bank has raised borrowing costs. But will the measure hamper growth even further, or is the nation on track for a rebound? Hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians have made their way back to the north of Gaza, but many of them won't have homes or businesses to return to. Israel's 15-month war on the Strip has reduced entire neighbourhoods to rubble. Healthcare, education, roads, agricultural land, and most utilities like water, electricity, sewage, and communication systems have been destroyed. The destruction has hit the very fabric of Palestinian life in Gaza, setting back its development by 69 years, according to the UN. Rebuilding the devastated Strip is expected to take decades and cost tens of billions of dollars. But how will returnees cope until reconstruction gets underway? We'll get to these issues with our guest in just a moment. But first, a report from Katia Lopez-Horayan.
It could take decades and roughly $50 billion, according to the UN, to rebuild Gaza. As Palestinians return to the north, many are finding they have nothing to go back to. More than 250,000 homes have been destroyed. Entire neighborhoods are unrecognizable.
Our house was demolished and we live in a tent. God help us, what can we do?
Clearing out more than 50 million tons of rubble will be a daunting and expensive task. The UN warns that process alone could take about 20 years and cost more than $1 billion. Infrastructure is another challenge. Hundreds of government buildings, schools, and universities have been leveled in 15 months of war. A UN report released in September estimates more than $18 billion worth of damage to Gaza's infrastructure, including the Strip's ravaged healthcare system.
The hospital was completely forced out of service and all departments were destroyed. The oxygen station, the operations unit, and intensive care and emergency services. Now that people of northern Gaza have returned, there is no medical service. We need to rebuild the hospital again.
Israel's blockade on Gaza and its border restrictions are slowing economic progress along the Strip. Some neighboring Arab countries like Qatar are concerned about backing Gaza's reconstruction only for it to be destroyed again in the future.
We cannot have an investment where we are investing in the reconstruction every time and something happens and it's just get destroyed and we do it again.
And U.S. President Donald Trump has drawn criticism for his recent proposal to uproot Palestinians to nearby countries.
I'd like Egypt to take people, and I'd like Jordan to take people. You're talking about probably 1.5 million people, and we just clean out that whole thing.
Although Jordan and Egypt have both rejected the idea, it highlights divisions, political, moral, and financial, that could hinder the rebuilding process. What's clear is that the journey back home will be long and overwhelming, much like Gaza's long-term reconstruction. Katia Lopez-Horayan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Nita Crawford is the co-founder of the Costs of War project and a professor at the University of Oxford. She joins us now from Oxford. Nita, the figures are staggering. The challenges are immense. Can Gaza be rebuilt?
Yes, Gaza can be rebuilt by the people of Gaza and external actors, but it's going to take a lot of work, obviously.
But where do we begin? The rubble, for starters. I mean, what happens to all of that?
Well, all of the rubble has to be removed, but of course there are human remains under the rubble, in addition to unexploded ordnance, which could be buried deep, or it could be right on the surface. It could look like toys to children. So the removal of the rubble itself is quite an endeavor. It will take a long time, and in fact, much of that rubble and the munitions may remain for decades.
Where would that rubble go? It can't stay within Gaza, can it?
Well, some of it will be reused in reconstruction as the foundation for buildings, or taken out of Gaza, can be recycled. But again, much of it will remain.
All right, so who is going to rebuild Gaza, and who's going to pay for that reconstruction?
Well, the bill should be, look, this is an international problem. The bill should be foot by those who destroyed Gaza, as well as any international organization that is able to help, and the private sector. So it's got to be an all hands on deck kind of situation.
What are your concerns, though, regarding an international rebuilding effort and the companies that are involved? When we look back at the reconstruction after the Iraq War and in Afghanistan too.
Right, there was a significant amount of work done that was well done, but there was a lot of corruption and shoddy work. Some of it done by private contractors, and already we see private contractors in Gaza doing some of the security labor. Some of it done by local workers. Some of it meant to be temporary and then rebuilt, but never, in fact, built with permanent structures. So there are significant concerns with who's doing the work, if it's private contractors and their oversight. And then there's also UN organizations, the Mine Action Removal, the World Health Organization. They will do some of this work, and hopefully in partnership with Palestinians.
And how do you do that while people are living there? What are the priorities? Obviously, you've got to get things like water and sewage systems and electricity sorted out first, don't you?
Well, the first thing is that people are going to die for the next several years as a consequence of the destruction of the infrastructure that has occurred over the last 15 months. Much of the death following any war is what demographers call indirect death. It's caused by the destruction of infrastructure. So it's an extreme priority to replace water and health care, sanitation, housing, the regular vaccines, and to stop what is likely to be another several years of continuing morbidity and mortality.
And of course, all of this assumes that the peace holds. Can you understand that companies and regional governments perhaps will be reluctant to invest in Gaza and put money into the reconstruction if it could all be flattened again, if war breaks out again?
Well, of course, no one knows if war will recur. Now, when the United States put $60 billion into Iraq reconstruction between 2003 and 2014, they did not anticipate that ISIS would come and that the war would resume. And then they're going to have to put the international community another $60 billion to repair post-ISIS. So this is essentially something that has to happen, whether or not war will resume. Of course, peace is a priority. Even though some of this money will be misspent, some of the money will be lost, some of the reconstruction effort will be shoddy, it still has to resume.
And what
has to go on.
What about Gaza's economy? We're not talking just bricks and mortar here, with things like businesses gone, schools, universities, hospitals. How long before Gaza's economy will be functioning again?
Well, just think about the schools. Most of the schools have been destroyed. More than 90% of the schools have been destroyed or damaged. Just getting the education system functioning is actually a boost to the economy. The same with healthcare. Getting those systems, education and healthcare, functioning will help the overall economy. Obviously, agriculture is also devastated. That is an economic boost as well. So those things must occur in order for the economy to recover.
Nita, it's been good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Chinese startup DeepSeek's launch of its latest AI chatbot model has sent shockwaves through the global tech sector. Shares in major tech firms like Nvidia fell sharply, with the chip giant losing almost $600 billion in market value in just a day. DeepSeek says its R1 model was made at a fraction of the cost of its rivals, raising questions about the scale of investment that US firms plan to plough into the technology. It also says that its model can be trained on 2,000 chips compared to nearly 16,000 for other leading models. The launch comes as the US is restricting the sale of the advanced chip technology that powers AI to China. Now, this is big news, and here at Counting the Cost, we've decided to let the dust settle. We'll take a more in-depth look at DeepSeek and its implications for the wider AI industry on a future edition of the programme. Now, OPEC plus oil exporting nations have been limiting output for more than 2 years now to try to shore up prices. The group and its ally Russia intend to gradually sell more barrels in monthly tranches beginning in April. But the Saudi-led cartel could begin to do that much sooner if it heeds US President Donald Trump's call to reduce global oil prices. Trump argues that energy revenues are helping Russia fund its war in Ukraine and that OPEC plus holds the key to ending the conflict by bringing down the price of crude. But will the group respond to Trump's demands, or will it stick to its own plans? We'll discuss that with our guest shortly. But first, Christina Harazim reports.
As a candidate and now as US president, Donald Trump has long promised to end Russia's war in Ukraine. The solution, he says, is to lower the price of oil. He insists that less energy revenue will give Russian President Vladimir Putin less money to fund the fighting.
So OPEC ought to get on the ball and they ought to drop the price of oil, and that war will stop right away.
Trump is calling on Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members to drop oil prices by increasing supply and lowering demand. This amid widespread uncertainty about his proposed tariffs and energy policies, including how his America First messaging will affect global economic growth.
He doesn't have a vision for the rest of the world. He has a very strong American vision, and I understand why Americans vote for him. It's a vision of America first. But on a global scale, all of this won't allow stability. It will only reinforce inequalities and insecurity.
OPEC Plus members are holding back about 6 million barrels per day of production. That's about 5% of global demand. Plans to increase supply by about 2 million barrels a day were delayed last year and pushed to at least April. Trump wants guarantees and is perhaps looking towards the leader of OPEC, Saudi Arabia, for support. After speaking with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, President Trump said he would ask the Saudis to increase their US investments to $1 trillion instead of the promised $600 billion.
The Crown Prince, who's a fantastic guy, to round it out to around $1 trillion. I think they'll do that because we've been very good to them.
It's unclear, however, if this apparent business partnership will affect OPEC's or Trump's next move. Christina Harazim, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Neil Atkinson is the former head of the Oil Industry and Markets Division at the International Energy Agency. He joins us now from Washington. Good to see you again, Neil. So, will OPEC Plus heed Trump's call, or will it continue to do its own thing?
Well, they will make a decision as to how they bring more barrels back into the market in April, on whether they do that or not, based on the market conditions at that time. And that's the decision they will always take. But I think the pressure that President Trump is seeking to place on Saudi Arabia and OPEC as a whole is very complicated for 3 reasons. Firstly, the Saudis and other members of OPEC need revenues. In the case of Saudi Arabia, they have a very, very big economic diversification program called Vision 2030, which needs to be funded. Secondly, the Saudis were one of the driving forces behind the creation of the OPEC Plus alliance at the end of 2016, which brought Russia into the fold. And thirdly, lowering oil prices would appear at first sight to be incompatible with President Trump's ambition to raise domestic US production under the mantra of drill, baby, drill.
And is he right when he says that if you deprive Russia of oil revenue, that will bring about an end to the war in Ukraine?
Well, it's difficult to imagine that the Russians are suddenly, very quickly, if prices, for the sake of argument, were to go down significantly, they're suddenly going to pack up and go home. It may well have an impact on the Russian economy, of course, but I would imagine that President Putin, being a dictator, is dedicated to the task of conquering Ukraine. And if it comes at the cost of the domestic economy, I would imagine that for quite a while, that is a price that President Putin would be willing to pay.
And OPEC members want to see a floor of, what, $80 a barrel on the price of oil? Is that realistic or sustainable?
Well, we've seen recently, following the news that sanctions against Russia are to be tightened, and following the news that there is a possibility of Iranian sanctions being tightened again, we saw the Brent crude price edge up back to $80 a barrel for a while. It's fallen back a little bit since then. As far as the Saudis and the others are concerned, an oil price significantly below, say, $70 a barrel would, I think, be very inconvenient for the reasons I was suggesting earlier about needing revenues.
All right, so what is the outlook for the price of oil right now? I mean, prices dropped when President Trump talked about putting the emphasis again on US energy production. Are prices likely to continue falling in the near term?
Well, as far as the near term is concerned, as things stand, if for the sake of argument there is no tightening of sanctions against Russia and Iran and possibly even Venezuela, based on the current outlook for demand, based on the current outlook for production from the non-OPEC countries that are not part of the OPEC Plus alliance, it looks as if the market will be in surplus during 2025. Things will change. The numbers will move around, of course. But currently, I'm expecting a softer market in 2025. However, the position changes if there is a toughening of sanctions against Russia and Iran and possibly Venezuela, because the removal of oil from the market that would come from those countries would probably move the market back into some kind of balance. But it's a balance. We're not talking about the market tightening significantly.
And what does all of this mean, Neil, for the likes of you and I, consumers at the pumps?
Well, yes, we talk about producers and we talk about prices that they would like, but it's consumers ultimately that pay the price. And of course, you know, consumers want as low a price as possible. And in many economies, particularly in Europe, high energy costs are a major factor in the political discourse, let alone the pocketbooks of consumers. So if prices were to remain lower than perhaps the producers might like, then that would be good for consumers, not just in the OECD countries, but for consumers around the world.
Always good to talk to you, Neil, on Counting the Cost. I always learn something when you're on the programme. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Central banks around the world have moved to cut interest rates after hiking them for months to bring down the cost of living. But, as usual, Japan is bucking the trend. The nation's central bank has recently increased borrowing costs to the highest level in 17 years, another step in its pivot away from ultra-low rates. Inflation increased in December and wages have risen. They're both now mostly back to where they were in the early 1990s. That's just before the spiral of falling prices and economic stagnation that became known as the lost decades began. So, what's happened in the Japanese economy over the years? Let's take a look. Overall, the nation's economy has grown very little over the past 3 decades. In 2024, its GDP is estimated to have grown by nearly a quarter since 1994. Now, in comparison, the US economy more than doubled in size over the same period. The economic stagnation comes with a drop in the general price of goods and services, so basically deflation. This was triggered in the early 1990s after the collapse in real estate prices and the burst of the stock market bubble. So, to try and pull the country out of this cycle, the Bank of Japan adopted a zero interest rate policy. Years later, in 2016, it implemented negative interest rates, but these unconventional policies did little to spur economic activity. Fast forward to the pandemic, when supply chain disruptions led to a surge in prices worldwide, and Japan still managed to maintain its ultra-low rates. It encouraged companies to pass on higher import costs to consumers while increasing employee salaries. But what impact will hiking rates have on the Japanese economy? To discuss this, we're joined now from Tokyo by Sayuri Shirai, an economist, professor of economics at Keio University and former Bank of Japan Policy Board member. Good to have you with us, Sayuri. So why is the Bank of Japan raising interests right now? What's it going to do to the economy?
So because, we have an inflation around 3.6%, but main reason why Bank of Japan is raising interest rate is to deal with super cheap Japanese yen. So Japanese yen started to depreciate about 30% since 2022. And this super cheap Japanese yen is creating a lot of headache to us through higher imported prices. Right now, inflation is about 3%, but 85% of inflation comes from food and energy.
So what is raising interest rates actually going to do to Japan's economy, given the problems?
Very good. Yes. So yen started to depreciate because of the growing interest gap between United States and Japan. So right now, even Bank of Japan raised interest rate, it's still only 0.5%. So compared to U.S. federal fund rate, 4.25 and 4.5%, huge interest differential. So a lot of exchange rate market participants, they try to have a carry trade, borrowing in Japanese yen and investing in U.S. securities and assets. So this is kind of a driving force behind sharp yen's depreciation. So to contain this kind of depreciation, Bank of Japan feel important to raise interest rate.
Is this the beginning of the end of stagnation, stagflation in Japan? Will Japan begin now to resemble a more conventional economy?
That's very difficult to say, because if we look at the Japanese stock prices, it's a very high side. And Japanese, some of the Japanese economy is benefiting from cheap Japanese yen's depreciation, because now we have so many foreign tourists coming to Japan. So tourism sector is doing well. So it's very difficult to say, we are facing, deflation risk because of this positive side.
And if President Trump puts tariffs on Japanese imports to the US, how is that going to affect monetary policy decisions in Japan in the future?
Yeah, so that's a very difficult thing, because the US is right now the top export destination for Japan. It used to be China, but now replaced by United States. So US is most important. So if US will charge higher import tariff on Japan, probably our economic growth will be much smaller than what current situations. So, now, for us, what is most worrisome is what will happen to US dollar index. Because if Mr. Trump is going to do inflationary policy in US, then that will raise the US interest rate. Then we have even bigger interest differential. So that might lead to the even more depreciated Japanese yen. That is our biggest concern.
Sayuri, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed, Professor.
Thank you.
Indonesian cuisine is known for its spicy dishes, but a steep rise in the price of chili peppers is a cause of concern for shoppers there. Heavy rain and attacks by insect pests have disrupted the harvest of some fruits and vegetables. Jessica Washington reports from Jakarta.
At this restaurant in Tangerang, one ingredient takes center stage, the red chili pepper.
For Indonesians, if we don't eat with chili, it feels like we haven't eaten at all. Chili is a necessity. When you eat just chili with just rice, it's delicious.
This restaurant uses more than 100 kilograms of chili each day. Most of it is for making sambal, a spicy condiment found across the archipelago.
I love spicy food. I love sambal, even when we eat it together at home. If we are eating something, we have to have spicy sambal.
Staff here say they shop at the market each morning to get the freshest produce for their customers. But in recent weeks, they've been shocked by the skyrocketing price of chili. The prices of some key staples, including rice, vegetables and eggs, have increased recently. It's the price of red chili peppers that has shoppers at this market talking. Just a few weeks ago, this 1 kilogram bag of chilies would have cost me around $3. Today, it cost $8. Indonesian cuisine varies across the many islands that make up this Southeast Asian country, but in every province, chili is an essential part of people's diets, even for breakfast.
I'm so surprised by the price of chili. The situation is difficult as all food prices are expensive right now.
In central Java, farmers say the heavy rain and insect attacks have disrupted their harvests. Scientists say climate change is one of the factors behind an increase in pests around the world.
It's complicated to maintain the plants now. If we don't spray them regularly, they will rot and die.
The National Food Agency has met with chili farmers, and local authorities say they are working to assist them. In the meantime, food vendors like Gilang Sanggra Prasarti are coming up with strategies of their own.
We really must manage our chili use because our turnover is down. We can't reduce the spiciness because customers won't come back. I use cayenne pepper. Usually I need at least 3 kilograms a day. And for green chilies, I need 1 kilogram a day.
The most popular dish she sells is called ayam penyet. Chicken is crushed into small pieces and mixed with green chilies, and then smeared onto another piece of fried chicken. She says she's giving customers 1.5 spoons of chili paste per dish instead of 2 until chili prices in Indonesia cool down. Jessica Washington, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost, Jakarta.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at A. Finnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.